We've got our knife here ready to be hand sanded. I've got it clamped into this portable bench vise. Unlike my other one, which is bolted onto the bench, this one clamps on, and so I've got it clamped on to the 2x4 here on the bench, and that allows the vise to clamp down this way, which is really nice on this for hand sanding the blades. I used to do it in the other one and clamped it like this on the sides of the tang, but that can mar up the metal pretty well. And so I got this set up and it works pretty well. I really like it. And I've got it clamped with a piece of wood under for support, so when we're putting pressure, this isn't just bending down and bending our tang. It's just red oak, even though it looks like bog oak. It's because it's got a lot of dirty water from the hand sanding on it. It's kind of interesting. For the hand sanding process, I like to use this type of wood push stick. A little longer would be nice, but it's pretty simple ideas. It's cut down here, it's beveled here, so I can get a nice corner to get up here in the plunge. This part here is brought up a little from this flat, and that's so that I can get a nice flat without being so level and poking myself with the tip. I can come up, and I've seen some that are even more like so, and so you can get up a lot more and still be flat. This is just pine, so the end here just does get fairly rounded, which can be a problem when you want to get into the plunge. And so I have another one here of similar construction made. I believe this is, it's anybody's guess, it's probably Cocobolo. I picked something hard so this stays nice and sharp, and I can get into this plunge here when I need to. I try not to make it difficult on myself to where I need this, but it is there when I need it. So I cut the sandpaper, I get the sheets, I cut them into these strips. It works really well. That way I can use all of the sandpaper from the whole sheet. I just put it over the push stick like this and hold it and sand, and when it gets worn, just pull it up, pull it up, pull it up until about halfway, and then I flip it over and do the same. I like the 3M sandpaper you just get from Home Depot. I've tried a lot of other brands and I haven't liked any of them, even some of the other name brands. This stuff, it wears out maybe a little faster than some of the other name brands, but it cuts well, and that's what I want. It's not so expensive that I use it while it cuts, and then when it's done, just throw it away, get a fresh sheet. I usually go through about 1 sheet of sandpaper per side per grit. So it's a little bit of sandpaper, but it's not too much, and it's far less than I've heard about people that just fold up a whole sheet and then use that, and it's not very efficient. So we've got all of these scratch lines going like this from our belt. What we want is a nice hand sanded finish with the grit lines going this way. So we're just going to sand these out. Now the key to hand sanding is patience. When you're grinding the blade, you just push it on there harder and you get it to go. You just kind of not force it, but power through. And with this, you can't really do that. You just have to be patient, and eventually these grit lines will come out. So we have 120 grit finish from the belt, and I'm going to start with 220 grit sandpaper, and then I'm going to move up to 320, and I'm going to do both of these. I'm going to wet sand them to keep the steel from forming dust in the air, and also to keep the paper from being clogged. I have heard of people oil sanding, but I've found that the oil just kind of gets gunked up and clogs up the paper even more. So I just do water. I do put oil on the tang because as far as we're concerned, the tang is finished. We don't want that to rust. If the blade rusts while hand sanding, that's okay because we're just going to sand it off again. But if we have to take it, anything we have to do here, anything we have to take off of the tang is just more likely that we're going to lose our nice flat that we established. And that's not good. We don't want that. So the first thing I like to do is focus on the plunge because that's sort of the trickiest part. What I'll do is I'll fill it in the black Sharpie. You could, use your blue layout fluid like the other makers like to do, but I like to use a Sharpie. And this part I'll do dry, just because it's easier for visibility and it's not a huge operation. And I'll probably do this first part with 400 grit paper, and you'll see why in a minute. So what I'll do is I've got this 1/8 of an inch chainsaw file, and I'm going to wrap my paper around it, and I'm just going to sand this plunge until the black goes away, being very careful not to stay on this angle we've established. If you put it up too far here, you're going to ruin this curve. It's going to look kind of wonky. And you also don't want to stay directly in the plunge. You want to maybe kind of skirt around it. Otherwise, you're going to sort of sand a little canal, and then when you go to sand the rest of here, it's going to be noticeable, and quite so. You'll be able to see the blade, and it kind of comes down like that, and that's no good. So you can kind of like this and hit it against the plunge here. You don't have to use, see we're coming up here a little bit and that's no good. You don't have to use an 1/8 of an inch chainsaw file. You could use whatever size you want. The bigger the size, the bigger your radius is going to be. I found an 1/8 of an inch to sort of be what I like. It can be tricky to get, like here in the center. Obviously the ends are easier because you just tilt it, but it's tough to get a nice, even angle to that, to get that perfectly without ruining the rest of it. Now you don't want to use the chainsaw file without sandpaper. You might not think in other operations that chainsaw files are too rough, but compared to this 400 grit or even 220, it's pretty rough, and you're just going to put in some deep scratches that you're going to spend a lot more time working out. Now the reason I use 400 straight away is because it takes quite a bit of work to get up into that curve with the push stick, and so this is just going to make it easier to reorient our grit lines this way than if I used a coarser paper. Like I said, it just takes patience. This is why it's important to get this as close as you can on the belt grinder, because then it's, oh, that's sharp, by the way. Be careful of this. It's a good idea for you and even I to get a longer support block so this tip is covered up and you don't stab yourself. Now when you think you've got it, when it sort of evenly and quickly takes all that Sharpie off, my advice is to go ahead and do it once or twice more, because sometimes if it's not completely radius with this chainsaw file, it'll come back later, you'll see a deep line in there, and it just can hide in there. So now I'm going to pull out our push stick, and what I like to do is I like to get this taken care of near the plunge, and then I'll do the tip, and then I like to come in between and fill in the rest. If you do all this first, then you're probably going to take off a lot here that you're going to take off anyways when you do the plunge and the tip. So I just like to get those ends, and then you can either take care of the middle or take care up here the ricasso. It doesn't really matter. But this is a nice thing you can work on after work, or when you've just got a little bit of time and you don't feel like getting really dirty. Your hands can get pretty dirty, but it's not as bad as your whole self. Now we've got some coarse marks here, even coarser than the 120. There's a couple of options of what we could do. We could quick throw it back onto the 120 and get these out, or we can just be patient and do it with hand sanding, because this area here, so this area tends to be thick, the edge, it's hard to get that thin, but this area here tends to get thin too much. I don't know why, maybe it's just me, but it happens. And so I try not to take it back to the belt, because you're going to remove more material and you don't want this to thin out, because then when you go to sharpen it, what's going to happen is it's going to pull up, and then you're going to have a recurved blade, but it might not be a nice recurve. It might be flat and then a little bit there, and it'll look wonky, and we don't want that. So I'm going to go ahead and just be patient and do it by hand, so I take less material off. And you want to be careful not to push up over the plunge line, because even though I'm not one of those makers that thinks it has to be perfectly crisp, when we take it to the Scotch-Brite, it'll round over a little bit, but you don't want to round it over too much. So we're going to use that to stop our push stick on every stroke and not go over. So when we did the grinding, we left it paper thin, and now when we do this and we sand along the edge, that's going to take it down even more, hopefully just a little bit before it comes to an edge, and that'll make sharpening it a lot easier. I'm not a big fan of sitting there with my sharpening stone grinding forever trying to get it to an edge. I know that's pretty common with a lot of other knives and a lot of other makers. Just have really fat edges and fat, thick cross sections. And if you haven't already noticed, I like thin knives, and so this isn't terribly thick stock, and it's a full flat, which is a nice, sharp, acute angle, and I take it to a thin edge before sharpening, and that's just so I can get a sharper, keener knife. Now here's a tricky part. There's a little bit of scratch left right on the curve of this plunge where it curves. And so I want to be careful that I'm still stopping my push stick before jumping up over onto this area and still getting that scratch mark so we don't round that over too much. Now obviously the harder steel is going to be a little harder to sand than the soft steel. But there's also something that's a little tricky that I've come across is if you're sanding this soft steel and your sandpaper gets dull, which it will because you're sanding steel, instead of taking material off, what's going to happen is it's going to burnish this surface, and it can actually roll the steel over these scratch lines, and so it looks like you've sanded through them, but they're still under there, which doesn't sound like that big of a deal until you go to etch it, and it takes that rollover part off, and now your nice sanded blade has this hatch pattern with grit marks this way and belt marks this way, and it's only on the soft steel because the hard steel doesn't roll over, and it looks kind of interesting. I don't want it on my blades, but it can be a big pain in the butt. So after I get this whole knife hand sanded, I'm going to go over this top half here quite a few more times just to make sure I eliminate that problem, because when you get it up to 400 grit and then on the Scotch-Brite and then you've got it etched and more Scotch-Brite and you see that come up, then it's a big pain in the butt, and you've got to start all the way back over with 220 grit sandpaper, and you've just created a lot more work for yourself. So being patient and spending more time will save you time in the long run. Just got that little bit of coarse, a little bit left from those coarse grit lines left. Just gonna focus on those, get those out. It's coming along. This whole time I'm pushing against my plunge line, making sure I'm getting that nice and sanded, because that can be a problem area. You know, I'm really bad about this, but if you've got a trash can right next to you to throw these spent strips away, it's really good. Otherwise, you finish a blade and you've got 100 little strips of paper, and then you've got a mess, and you trip over them. And take my own advice here. Now you can feel the consistency of that edge when it starts to get real thin. Not only will it cut your finger, it probably won't cut you unless you really overdo it, but you can, the thinner steel does make a different sound, and you'll be able to tell. They're getting there. That's why it's just important to try and get them all out on the 120 belt. Just save yourself some time. It is rewarding to see them disappear just sanding by hand, though, even if it is a big pain and takes a little bit of time. You'll learn real quick when to throw away these sanding strips and when to get a new one. Just about gone. It's also good to occasionally get these coarser lines to make you appreciate the 120 grit lines, so you don't complain about those. There, I think I got them.